All right, welcome to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie, and tonight we have an exciting and a fun program for everybody. I have Professor David McQueen and George Bond here with me tonight. We are going to be interviewing Charles Darwin. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Before we get into it, though, I do want to remind anybody who may not yet be subscribed. If you enjoy debates, interviews, discussions, and more, then please hit that subscribe button and share around this content, as the truth is important. If you appreciate what we are doing here on Standing for Truth, then please consider supporting us and keeping us working full-time, putting out full-time content for you guys. You can support us through our official website or through Patreon. Thank you, everybody. So that being said, or I should say Charles Darwin and George Bond, good to have you gentlemen. George, let's hand it over to you, brother.
Well, thank you, well-dressed, well-groomed host. That's really great. And true to my form, I'd like to start off with a little bit of humour. Now, did you know I was trying to organise a hide-and-seek competition, but as you know, good players are really hard to find.
Hello.
Well over your head, that one.
Hello.
Now, for the women in the chat, what did God say after creating Adam? I must be able to do better than that. And then, what did God say after creating Eve? Practice makes perfect.
Oh, I know those stories.
Yeah.
I've heard those stories. I can see people's faces.
Is that you, Mr. Darwin?
Professor McQueen went to the field and he left me with this cup of tea, and he told me that somebody named George, an engineer, was going to appear on my screen along with his friend, Mr. Donnie. It's amazing to see pictures that move. I know all about photographs, but moving pictures, I don't know that much about.
Well, this is going to be an education for you. And how did you get here, Mr. Darwin?
Well, I got into H.G. Wells' time machine. It was later on, after I had married Emma, and so it was after 1859. I don't know exactly the date. I'm a bit kind of confused coming forward to the 21st century, but Professor McQueen left me a number of things. Apparently, Ms. McQueen is supposed to help me. Very odd. He had this magazine he wanted me to see about something called a Batman. Now, 1962, when he bought this, that my book had already been published by then. George, this doesn't mean that men evolved into bats in my absence, did they?
No, only in comic books they did.
He left me this book called Darwin's Black Box. And he said that after Ms. McQueen calls me on my cell phone, I would get to know about a black box. I don't wait, what is this? What is this? This thing is called what? There must be a way. Which button do I press to turn? Hello, hello? Yes, of course I would like some tea, but I don't understand how this thing works. Oh, well, you know, in 1860, if someone had a one-way conversation holding a black brick to their ear, we consider them insane. What do you think, George?
Well, a lot of changes have occurred since your time, Mr. Darwin. But what I'd like to do, since we've got the pleasure of your company here.
Yes,
We'd
sir.
like to take some time to ask you some questions regarding your theory, but I'd rather it be more of an informal discussion rather than just a question and answer session. Do you agree, Mr. Darwin?
I agree. You know, George, am so thankful that I brought a first edition of my book that I published in 1859. You know, it sold for 15 shillings. Professor McQueen told me that that's worth about 100 US dollars. So it's not worth very much, but I brought you one. Sadly, your copy's a bit damaged, but you can fix it somehow. And one of the questions I want to ask you is how my book is done, but I wonder of those 1,200 copies that sold that first day. I was so pleased they sold out. I couldn't believe that people were spending a week's wage on my book. How has the book turned out over the years? What's a copy like this worth, I wonder?
Well, I bought my first Origin of Species book when I was 16, somewhere around about that age. I bought it in a second-hand bookstore, Mr. Darwin, for I think it was something like 20 or 40 cents. I hope that doesn't offend you. Yes.
And Professor McQueen, before he left, showed me some copies. Very, very odd, this whole monkey to man business, but I know that it's been in publication pretty much continuously for the last 162 years. That's the subtraction, isn't it, from now till then? It's hard for me to believe what I'm told by McQueen, but let's go ahead to your questions, Mr. George. I understand you're in Australia. I'm a bit fragile. I'm a bit frazzled after my trip in the time machine. Did I end up visiting you in Australia? I mean, you look 162 years old, but I guess you're not, are you?
Oh, now, no need for that. Well, Mr. Darwin, as you mentioned, it's been 162 years since you proposed your theory of natural selection. I'll have to say, though, we've had a lot of time to study its claims.
Good.
And I need to run you through just one example, which I'll bring up later on, which demonstrates a point. And well, actually, I'd like to share a screen, Donnie, just to
that's some of this 21st century logo.
Yes, just to show Mr. Darwin that we've left no stone unturned in finding.
I want to know how some of my predictions turned out. I'm sure the chart behind me here, you were able to find all the different transitions, but please go ahead.
No, just bear with me. Just bear with me, because I just want to make this point that we have actually left no stone unturned, Mr. Darwin, in finding evidence for the theory. So,
well, I'm glad somebody has gone. McQueen is apparently a geologist, from what I gather, not a very good one, but he doesn't immediately believe my theory, but he's out looking for these transitional forms.
And how about that? My computer's starting to freeze. What's happening?
Well, I can go on to comment how nice Ms. McQueen has been. She has brought me tea in a china cup, and when I look at it, it's Wedgwood china. And it turns out I ended up marrying my first cousin. I hope that's not illegal in the 21st century. I married my first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and her daddy made china. So how nice to have a cup of tea from Ms. McQueen. It's really something to think about. As George deals with this technology that's truly science fiction to me, I'll show you a book that Professor McQueen left me. He claimed that this is a biology book used here in the United States. This is a 2012 edition, and it turns out I'm mentioning this, George. I wonder why. And why are there two pictures of you on my screen?
We've got double the George, but now we're just back to one. George. Good to have you back.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Well, as I said to Mr. Darwin, we have left no stone unturned in searching for evidence for evolution. As you can see there's some really dedicated people there that have gone to a lot of trouble.
Now, that wouldn't be an image of this animal, would it?
Well, that's an elephant giving birth to a hominid. So that kind of proves
that. That's amazing.
That kind of proves your theory a little bit, doesn't it?
I misunderstood. I misunderstood that photograph, Mr. George, as being a bowel movement from this creature. I don't know why there's such a discussion about
it may have been, but
and elephants in the United States. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
But Mr. Darwin, let's get serious here, okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, a very famous British geneticist and evolutionary biologist by the name of J.B.S. Haldane, you probably don't know him. He was probably after your time. He observed that the Dashavatas, that is the 10 principal avatars of Lord Vishnu,
yes,
this is Hinduism.
Yes, I know that.
Are a true sequential depiction of the great unfolding of evolution. These avatars of Vishnu show an uncanny similarity to your biological theory of evolution of life on Earth. Could it be that your origin of species had its origins from the great Hindu myth?
Well, that's fascinating. You know, when I go into London to be part of, you know, I am part of the Royal Society. I'm a fellow at the Royal Society, and some of these guys have come from India, and they talk about Vishnu, and I'm surprised that my theory would have any link to him. What do you make of it, Mr. George?
Well, the fact that it was proposed 3,000 years before your theory, forgive me if I'm a bit abrupt here, but that would suggest that you plagiarized that theory, don't you think?
Well, I've known some Australians when I went on my voyage in the 1830s, and I assume that you're abrupt and unkind. So go on.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Now, I need to share the screen again because I've got something to show you. I want to test your theory based on what you yourself wrote.
Oh, okay. Very interested. I'm very interested in that.
Yes.
Let me get out a copy of my book so we can go to the actual chapter that you want to try to test.
Do you see that, Donnie?
Yes.
Okay, so it's up on the screen. Mr. Darwin, on that screen in front of you, you will see an image of a beetle. It's known as the bombardier beetle. Now it squirts a lethal mixture of hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide into the face of its enemies. Now, these two chemicals, when mixed together, literally explode. So in order to store them inside its body, the bombardier beetle has evolved a chemical inhibitor to make them harmless. At the moment the beetle squirts the liquid out of its tail, another anti-inhibitor is added to make the mixture explosive once again. Now, the chain of events that could have led to the evolution of such a complex, coordinated and subtle process is beyond biological explanation on a simple step-by-step basis. Yes.
Mr. George, Uh, I now, at this point in my life, no longer believe in a creator God. So this troubles me. How come the beetle doesn't explode in its own body?
Oh, because as I mentioned previously, Mr. Darwin, it has inhibitors that prevent it from doing so. And there's a 6-point explanation to the beetle's defensive apparatus, which is used, by the way, to repel attackers with its components of. These are the components of the system. Okay.
Well, Mr. George, you're an engineer. You see design in things like this. I don't see any design in this sort of thing. It had to have evolved.
Well,
When I was in the process of flunking out of University of Edinburgh, my dad wanted me to be a medical doctor, but I spent my time studying beetles like this, and I can tell you that none of them ever exploded in my face.
Well, this is the problem, Mr. Darwin. You'll find that the actual components of the system in that particular beetle is very hard to explain based on a segmental, gradual, simplistic upgrading of systems to get to its current form. There are six.
Are you saying, Mr. George, that this should be covered in chapter 6 of my book called Difficulties on My Theory?
Well, yes. There's a number of other things. Even like you proposed the eye was not an issue because you could say that it actually formed in successive gradual small changes.
Of course.
But that particular one is very hard to explain based on your theory. By the way, that's one badass beetle. I wouldn't suggest anyone trying to tackle that particular critter because it'll burn you. It'll burn.
Oh, too bad. I'll be careful not to pick that one up.
By the way, Mr. Darwin, I'm actually a retired engineer who uses science every day. So I guess you can classify us as analytical scientists. So I guess in part I am a scientist.
Before Professor McQueen left, he gave me a copy of this magazine called Acts and Facts. And the fellow that runs this, hard to pronounce, Dr. Randy Galuza, I was looking through and seeing if he was a fellow of the Royal Society like me, or he does have a Bible degree like I do. My only earned degree was in Bible, after all. And I noticed that he was an engineer with all kinds of things and an MD and an Army officer. How come you engineers are so convinced that you can't actually get from chimps to humans, as I would think you could?
Well, I think the fact that we are engineers makes us qualified to recognize design when we see it. I guess that's the simple explanation. To go through it in greater detail would require a fair bit of time for me to respond. But I have read your book, Mr. Darwin. Firstly, I read it when I was around 16. And I'm sorry to inform you, but it bored the bejesus out of me, as they say.
Well, I'm troubled about this joker, Professor McQueen. He said that he'd only read half my book, and at that half, he actually had fallen asleep. Now, the two chapters he wanted me to talk to him about is chapter 6, the difficulties of my theory. See, even in the 1850s, I knew there were some problems. I wrote this: long before having arrived at this part of my work, a crowd of difficulties will have occurred to the reader. Some of them are so grave that to this day, I can never reflect on them without being staggered. So you're saying that there are difficulties in my theory that over the last 162 years have not been worked out, Mr. George?
That's correct, Mr. Darwin, and I'll go through some of those. But before we do, if our kind host would share my screen.
Least I could do. Go ahead.
Okay, now I've been accused of lying in terms of having read the book, but you'll see on the screen there, that's the Kindle version of the book, and you'll notice
Yeah.
it says 77%. Can anyone in the audience please tell me why I stopped at 77%?
Now, Kindle, is that one of those publishers in Edinburgh? What's Kindle?
Kindle is that's a bit hard for you to understand. It's actual software that's installed into your little
This is the black
screen.
box that
Yeah, the
I
black
have here.
box. That's it. Okay, well I'll tell you the reason why I stopped at 77%. Apart from falling asleep, but at 77%, you come up to the sections on glossaries and index. So 23% of that book is full of glossaries and index. But more importantly, Mr. Darwin, can I ask you why was the alternate title of the book hidden inside it and not on the cover of the book? I note with interest that the alternate title, it says the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life.
So many of my colleagues that I go to London and meet with and drink with and so forth, so many of them have commented about the most important part of my book not being the origin of species by means of natural selection. That was actually thought of by others, perhaps all the way back to this Hindu mythology. But what I came upon that was so important is, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now, we have to be very careful here. I have to look around to make sure that my wife, Emma, is not here, because she was a Unitarian Universalist. And so she got really angry at me when she began to realize that the implications of my book would not be summarized until I got past all of those appendices and so forth, 500 pages into the book. And she said, you can't publish this because when I go to church at the local Church of England, I can't have them saying to me that in your last paragraph, you say, these laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability, as a consequence to natural selection, entails the divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object that we're capable of conceiving of, namely the production of higher animals. And he says there's a grandeur in this view of life. And then I go on to say that while the planet has been cycling on according to fixed laws, no divine intervention, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. For Emma's sake, I saved the word evolved for the last word in the last paragraph of the last chapter. The very idea that humans might have not been specially created by this false idea of God in the Garden of Eden and all the mythology that I've come to believe about the Bible. Can you see how angry my wife was and why I had to take in this edition well over 450 pages to finally say what I thought?
I can understand that, Mr. Darwin, but just a couple of things on what you just said there.
Yes.
Since you have a degree in theology, I believe.
That's correct.
You would be aware that the Bible states that close cousin marriages are forbidden. And I'm wondering why you married your wife when she was your first cousin, or?
Yes, she was my first cousin. And of course, I married her for her money. Her dad was a very wealthy man, Wedgwood. He owned this company. A lot of people don't know that her father, her grandfather, all argued against human slavery. I've come to understand that I was born on the same day as this president in America. What was his name? Abraham something. Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, I was born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln, and I have become concerned because my only earned degree is in the Bible. And let me explain to you. I've got some of my autobiographical writings here. When I went on board the Beagle in the I would hope you've got some photographs or drawings of some kind of the Beagle that you can show in the next hour and a half. But when I went on board the Beagle, please understand that I believe that the Bible was true. As a matter of fact, Captain Fitzroy, when I went on board the Beagle, he hired me as a favor to my dad because I was worthless as a country pastor and so forth. And so he hired me because I was a creationist. He wanted me to go around the world with him to find evidence of creation. Of course, I didn't find that. I found evidence of evolution. But in those early days, Mr. George, Mr. Donnie, I would actually argue with the sailors. I would say, the 10 Commandments are true. It's wrong to have a girl in every port. I came back from the voyage, married my first cousin, and had 10 children. What do you think of that, Mr. Donnie? Or Mr. George?
Oh, well, I want to ask you another question on one of the points you made about laws. I note with interest in your book, you list numerous laws, 20, 30, 40, 50. I can't remember the number, but
Yes.
Are you aware of the law of biogenesis?
Oh, of course not. And by the way, I must be apologetic. The H.G. Wells time machine just scrambled my head. I married Emma for love, not money. But go on. What is this law of biogenesis about?
Well, the law of biogenesis simply says that life can only be created from life. So that kind of proves the Bible. And to my knowledge, it has never been disproven yet. Evolutionists dispute it, dismiss it, deny it, reject it. I don't know why, because science has never disproven that particular law.
Well, I do find that troubling too. But go on. Tell me a bit about the diagram behind me that this fool McQueen left me. Surely there must have been found in the last 160 some years the transitional forms between all these different species.
Well, thank you for asking. That was one of your predictions made in the book, was that you suggested that there should be an unlimited number of intermediate forms or transitionals.
Yes.
That will be found in the various geological layers. However, that's not the case. And I can cite a number of scientific organizations that have attested to that fact. I'm just trying to find my notes here. Here we go.
Well, let me interject from chapter 10 of my book. I understand people can follow along in my book nowadays. Chapter 10 begins with this paragraph. Let us now see whether the several facts and rules relating to the geological succession of organic beings better accord with the common view of the immutability of species. Now, Mr. George, that's my understanding of what the Bible said in the 1850s, or with that of their slow and gradual modification through descent and natural selection. Now, don't tell me you have a problem with the idea of intermediate fossils and the finding that natural selection is a law.
Well, yes, yes, I do. This is why, unfortunately, Mr. Darwin, you're not depicted in a kind way with regards to that prediction that you've made. As you
Oh,
can
don't
see,
show Emma that one. She'll be
as,
offended.
as you can see, they've got you in a coma there since 1882. So apparently, no transitional fossils have been found, although many people claim that they have. Unfortunately, none exist, and I'll show you why. Now,
Okay.
in the as you can see there, since 160 years of geological records, we have yet to find one, and I'll underline that, indisputable transitional form. In fact, this is what the scientists have concluded.
I want to
Human
hear this.
origins research is a big mess, a big mess. And this is what they say from the scientists at the American Museum of Natural History. They state, when you look at the narrative of hominin origins, it's just a big mess. There's no consensus whatsoever. People are working
But
under...
Mr.
Yeah.
George, on the cover of this book, it shows clearly the ape to man progression. Are you saying that this is a artist's conception and doesn't express reality?
Oh, exactly, Mr. Darwin. Exactly. They're just pictures on a page. They're just lines
Oh,
on a
well,
drawing.
that's troubling. I'm going to take the cover off this book. I don't want to see arguments against my idea. Please go on. Tell me about what another problem you have as an engineer.
Well, I'll show you, Mr. Donny there. If you could share my screen again, I'll just find the section, and I'll just share this particular concern that I have with Mr. Darwin. How's that? Can you see that?
Looks good. Looks good.
Yes, I can see that.
Many call this phylogenetic tree, but you'll see the red lines or the red bars there represent what we know. The
Oh
white
no,
bar...
you're making me sweat. This doesn't seem to be innumerable intermediate forms.
Well, the white bits are completely imaginary and complete interpretations. And when you remove those white bars, this is what you get. That looks more like creation rather than evolution.
Oh, now
See, when you remove those imaginary lines, you're left with
yes.
creation.
Now don't tell me that you agree with this fellow I read so much about. Paley was dead by the time I was in school, but in my theology training, I was forced to read Paley's book. And in those days, I thought Paley was right, that there were clear evidences of design. If you find a watch on the beach, it must mean that somewhere there's a watchmaker. Now that I'm a fellow of the Royal Society and now that I am a published author, I realize that that's wrong, that Paley was wrong. Do you actually think, Mr. George, Mr. Donnie, that Paley was correct?
I don't know much about Mr. Paley, but I'd like to get to more of the points of the problems of your theory.
Okay.
You can explain them to us, but I need our lovely host there to share the screen for me again so I can make my point. Just, Donnie, please share my screen.
I'd love to ask Mr. Darwin, did you have this whole screen share feature back in your day?
Oh, no. This would be science fiction, H.G. Wells kind of stuff to me. Oh, it's so amazing to see these photographs of caterpillars and butterflies. Well, that clearly shows evolution, doesn't it, Mr. George?
Well, Mr. Darwin, I would like to remind you what you yourself said in the book. I guess it was a falsification of your theory. You stated, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, I showed you one with the bombardier beetle and the mixture of chemicals that it produces to deter other predators. But I'd like to ask you, with regards to what you see on that screen there,
Yes.
you'll see a caterpillar. A caterpillar turns into a butterfly within months. So how do you explain a caterpillar with 12 legs going to 6 legs?
Well, keep in mind that when I was in the process of flunking out of med school at University of Edinburgh, I would wander in the woods and I would pick up caterpillars with 12 legs and then watch them become butterflies with 6 legs. Do keep in mind I was drunk most of the time, so I never thought much about it.
Well, I think this presents a fairly large problem for your theory, Mr. Darwin, because you can see the important part there. The caterpillar goes from no sex organs to a butterfly which has sex organs. So the blaring question is, which one actually evolved first?
The
caterpillar or the butterfly?
Well, surely you can answer this question. In my section on difficulties, I asked this question. But as by this theory, innumerable transition forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Now, what I figure is that in the 100 years from 1859 to 1959, you apparently were alive in 1959. This fellow McQueen was, apparently. And by that time, had they found the transitions between all these different butterflies and a reasonable explanation for how it could go from no wings to 2 pairs of wings?
Never, Mr. Darwin. No one has ever found any intermediate or transitional forms between the caterpillar and the butterfly.
Oh, I'm troubled by this.
Yes, and many other organisms as well. By the way, as I showed you previously with that phylogenetic tree, all the white lines are imaginary. Remove those, and you get a scenario which describes and demonstrates creation rather than evolution.
Well, so I was left this clock by Professor McQueen. It's almost 7:30 now, Central Time, and we're supposed to take a break in 15 minutes, I understand. Mr. Donnie, do you have a question from the audience? I understand that somewhere out there are people named Flutes Khan or somebody that wants to ask me questions.
Yeah, so here's a question from Renzo Flutes. The question is, can someone please ask Mr. Darwin about Huxley?
Huxley. Buy a copy of my book, read it. I'm not going to talk about Huxley. George Bond may want to. Mr. George may, but I'm not going to talk about Huxley in a public forum like this.
I believe he was termed Darwin's bulldog. Am I right there, Mr. Host?
I believe you are right, George.
I wonder why.
I don't need bulldogs. I need fossil evidence from behind me here that dogs evolved into cats and dinosaurs and other things. Where's that evidence, Mr. George?
There is no evidence. I'm sorry.
You're telling me that with 162 years of geologists going to every continent, including that backward land of Australia, they haven't been able to find the definitive proof of transitional forms between the different species?
Not to my knowledge, unless they're keeping it under wraps, and maybe they intend to reveal it at some future point in time. But no, there's no such evidence whatsoever. Nothing nothing but imaginary lines connecting different fossils, interpretation of what they consider facts.
Well,
So
the
I don't consider that science, to be honest.
the sad thing is that when H.G. Wells put me in the machine, he told me when he brought me back at the end of this day that I wouldn't remember what I've learned. But I must admit, sitting here drinking tea from my wife's father's Wedgwood china, I'm troubled by this. And I'm troubled because the works of Lyell and others, I gradually began to lose my faith in the Bible and came to the point, and I want to return to this when we come back the second hour, but I will read this much from my own autobiographical lines. I wrote this in 1839. And so let me show you how far I had come away. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress in casting off the Bible and have never since doubted, even for a single second, that my conclusions were correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone, and that would include Mr. Donnie and Mr. U, George, as Christians, I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. Because if it's true, the plain language of the text of the Bible seems to show that men who do not believe, and by the way, that would include my father, my brother, and most of my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. You know what that is? I wrote this. It's a damnable doctrine.
Well, Mr. Darwin, with all due respects, you should know your Bible fairly well, but in the King James Version on Proverbs 6, I think it's verse 6 or so, thereabouts, it states something like this. It says, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways to be wise,
Yes.
which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provided her meat in the summer and gathered her food in the harvest." Now, this is the important point here, Mr. Darwin.
Yes.
Do you ever wonder how the supposedly goat herders who wrote the Bible knew 3,000 years ago that worker ants were females when modern science only found out this fact in the late 20th century? What have you got to say to that?
Well, when I was wandering about collecting bugs and beetles and all that kind of thing, I saw ants, but I figured they were male and female, workers, bees. So I'm shocked by what you've told me. It troubles me very deeply that with the amount of time that I labored over this, that the whole issue of the foundation of my idea, for example, this guy at this thing called ICR, Dr. Galuza, he apparently thinks that the whole idea of natural selection should be replaced. But replaced with what? What are the viewpoint of you two on that whole issue of natural selection? In Galuza's view, is very poorly done.
Well, we all have our biases, Mr. Darwin. I can only look at the similarities between the Bible and what we actually see, what science actually describes, and I can see the similarities between the two. Now, as I said, everyone has their biases and they make interpretations, so I guess we're governed by our own beliefs.
Well, Professor McQueen, before he left, said, Donnie, you have studied this issue of species and genera and so forth. What view have you come to about natural selection?
Well, that's a good question, Charles Darwin. And if I could answer it by kind of asking you a question. Okay. Are you aware, Charles Darwin, of what a mutation is?
I'm aware that sometimes individuals are born with withered limbs, I don't know. I'm a bit scrambled from the time machine. I don't know if the word mutation was used in 1850 and 1860, but I've seen bad things happen. One, as I'll talk about next hour, what drove me from the Bible, what drove me from God was the death of my beautiful daughter. So, what do you mean by the word mutation?
Well, that's a good question, Charles. From my understanding, Darwin, being you, did not know that DNA and genetics would be so important in this whole debate of ancestry,
Hey, wait,
creation versus
wait.
evolution.
DNA? Is that like? See, I'm a fellow of the Royal Society. That's FRS. Does DNA stand for Donnie knows a lot, or DNA? Yeah, Donnie knows a lot.
Yeah, that's close. That's close.
That's very good.
So, since your time, Charles, we've come to an understanding of what's really going on in the body, and there's a study now called genetics, and we've understood that mutations, which should be the driving force of your theory, turn out to be damaging, as you've pointed out, for the most part, to biological organisms.
Now,
so if this is what
Mr. Donnie, you need to stop there. And, I know about Lamarck. I know what Lamarck said was true, that as you can get the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The giraffe reached up and up and up, and the gorilla reached up and up and up to get to the bananas. Are you telling me that these acquired characteristics are not inherited?
Yes, and unfortunately, Darwin, since your time,
Yes,
we figured out that natural selection, which you loved so much, needs to act on genetic variation, and that genetic variation comes about through mutations. But mutations are damaging, disease-causing, deleterious, and unfortunately, we're never going to get that fish to fisherman, molecules to man, pond scum to people with mutations and natural
wait
selection.
a minute. McQueen wouldn't allow me to read every part of this book, but apparently my idea is picked up by a lot of these biologists. Like they talk about how does this work on this black box here? The evolution of populations. And they say kind things. They say genetic variation within populations. A population shares a common gene pool. And they go on to talk about patterns of evolution. And then over on page 379, look what it's got here, Mr. Donnie. It's got a whole section on primate evolution. Are you actually saying that the authors of these 21st century textbooks are lying to the children?
In a word, yes.
Well, I find that deeply troubling.
Well, Mr. Darwin, if I can just cite none other than the president of the International Union of Physiological Sciences. He's a professor. He's a professor. His name is Dennis Noble at the Oxford University.
I went to Oxford. Tell me what he said.
Now, he has presented a paper where he set out to show that all the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, that is, this is also called the neo-Darwinism, have been disproved. He says, Noble says he hopes for a new theory of evolution that will explain the evidence. So it seems that no one really believes your theory anymore.
Well, this is deeply troubling because my Bible degree was from one of the units of Oxford. I didn't go over to the science part of it. I did have some occasion to go with Charles Lyell on some of his field trips here and there. But the next thing you'll be telling me is that the idea that my own relative came up with, that the earth was 100 million years old. Now, don't tell me that that has been shown to be not true. Surely the evolution of all these different creatures had to occur in more than Bishop Ussher's 6,000 years. Let me spit into my coffee cup. Bishop Ussher, 6,000 years. Is not the earth at least 100 million years old?
Mr. Darwin, I'd like to remind you, even in your own book, it's shown that geologists of your time looked at erosion rates and suggested that the Earth's landscape would erode to sea level in less than 6 million years. Why would you believe 100 million years without evidence when the geologists of the time were contradicting that particular scenario? And
well, Mr. George, I'm angry at you now because it was one of my relatives that came up with that 100 million idea as an astronomer. But this whole business of the erosion rate and this issue of you two being critical of natural selection, I have a note here from Professor McQueen. He said, when you get exhausted by the argument of truth, ask Donnie to drop your video and then you can take a break. Can you two continue this discussion while I get Mrs. McQueen to make me some more tea?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great interview so far. You've earned yourself another tea, and we'll see you in a bit there, Mr. Darwin. So I've got a few things to present as well, George. But before I do, go ahead. I want to hand it to you. I'm just finishing.
Well, I think Mr. Darwin is going to take an Australian break, where 10 minute he'll take a 10-minute break and be back in an hour.
Yeah, so we're going to.
Well, one of the interesting things I found, Donnie, and I think most people are aware of these now, is the old Darwin's finches baloney, and I'll call it baloney because that's what it is, because they have now had decades to study this finch, and if I can share the screen, I'm going to show the people in the audience there what actually they have found with regards to Darwin's finches. So just bear with me while I scroll down my screen and find the section.
Actually, George, I'm going to deal with this objection first.
Okay.
What would be your response, I guess, to the critics who would say, well, it's not accurate for us to say there's been no transitional forms since the time of Darwin because, and then they will point to their select few favorites, right? They'll look to Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, the whale series, and the therapsids, your mammal-like reptiles, for example. So they can point to some, and they do point to some. So how would you respond if they say we're misrepresenting their precious theory?
Well, as I read earlier, there is no scientific consensus on any of those transitional forms. I'm not aware of one indisputable fossil find that they can classify as a true transitional form. That's the way I would answer that. And if anyone has any information that clearly shows that I'm wrong, then please present it.
That's a great response. So yes, they can point to a select few, right? A select few interesting mosaics.
Yeah.
Right. Even the platypus, if found in the fossil record, if it were an extinct creature, they could come up with all sorts of stories and interpretations simply based on the mosaic nature of the platypus. And that's typically what they do with these mammal-like reptiles, the therapsids that we had Dr. Matthew McLean on. about a year ago now to discuss. Okay, the problem is they should have countless to the point that it cannot be disputed. I mean, the fossil record in general is very fragmentary, and oftentimes they build a case for their theory based on one single jawbone, let's say. So the point is, a few interesting mosaics is exactly what we would predict as well as creationists, because we've put forth the case and the model that since we are made in the image of God, right, there should be something about us that reflects the divine. So we should be able to look to the biological world and get a sense or an idea into how God designed based on the way we design. Okay, so we can look at the way humans design, and we build in homologous patterns, for example. I mean, you can pick any mode of transportation from any manufacturing company from around the globe, and you're going to find thousands of similarities. We also, believe it or not, build in hierarchical patterns, right? We know that nested hierarchies are products of design, but to the transitional feature argument, it just turns out that we, as human engineers, design modes of transportation, vehicles, that blend the features of multiple different types of vehicles. For example, right here, we're looking at an amphibious assault vehicle, right? A vehicle that is built for the land and the sea. Now, this vehicle would not perfectly reflect a vehicle just for the sea or just for the land. No, it's this perfect transitional vehicle that can go between sea and land. We also see all sorts of interesting mosaics, transitional like vehicles in the design world when it comes to, for example, here the Jeep Gladiator, which is a mix of like a Jeep and a truck. You've got the crossover SUVs. I mean, it's now become pretty well impossible to classify many of these types of vehicles, like the crossover SUVs. Is it a van? Is it an SUV? No, it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? And the Ford Flex here. See, the thing is, we are just in the infancy of, I typically point out that we're in the infancy of understanding the DNA language. We're also in the infancy of understanding design. Okay, we see the way God designs. Yeah, we see some interesting mosaics in the fossil record, Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, the Therapsids, for example. Very interesting group of creatures. But we're in the infancy because God already thought of this, and we're just thinking of it now, and just how beneficial, you know, some of these designs are from a design standpoint. So yes, a few interesting mosaics are not a problem for the design hypothesis. Okay, I mean, we could look to different types of tools, different types of wrenches. We could look to, let's say, the fencing pliers. I mean, look at this. The fencing pliers are designed with a multi-purpose design, which incorporates a staple puller, staple pincher, fencing wire cutter, fencing wire puller, fencing wire crimper. The point is, we have pliers that are an interesting mosaic for a design purpose. Okay, and we can line things up any way we want, especially when it comes to these interesting mosaics, and tell any story that we want. But here's the thing, that's low quality science, low confidence science, as we've typically pointed out in the past. Okay, so yes, there are a few interesting mosaics. We realize that. Okay, and that's exactly what we would expect from the design standpoint. But if universal common ancestry is true, fish to fisherman evolution is true, bacteria-like organism to biologist evolution is true, we should find countless. Okay, there should be just thousands and thousands and thousands. It cannot be denied. But the fact that we only find an interesting few that we can sit here and argue about all day does not prove their case. The last thing that I'll say is Mr. Lizard in the chat was pointing out the law of monophily, right? Cats don't evolve into dogs. Dogs don't evolve into cats. The law of monophily is pretty well the fact that we cannot outgrow our ancestry, right? A mammal's never going to stop being a mammal. A vertebrate's never going to stop being a vertebrate. And that's why they'll say, essentially, according to their story, that birds today, modern birds today, are still dinosaurs, because you can't outgrow your ancestry. Okay, but here's the thing. the law of monophyly is better understood from a created kind perspective. Okay, God originally created creatures thousands of years ago, and they have evolved in the sense that they've adapted. Okay, natural selection is not a creative mechanism. It doesn't add anything new, but it can select for advantages based on the environment, depending on what the creature is. Okay, so yeah, the original created kinds have not outgrown their ancestry. Okay, there's no crossing between kinds, right? Your felid kind is not going to cross into the canid kind, for example. So the law of monophyly does not support this story that we had single-celled like ancestors evolving into multi-celled ancestors, which evolved into fish, amphibians, right? Reptiles, mammals, monkeys, human beings eventually. So yeah, we understand the law of monophyly, and you can only go back so far before it becomes imagination, right? We would point out that, dogs today produce a variety of dogs. There's incredible variation. And oftentimes what we see in the fossil record, okay, whether it's pre-flood or immediate post-flood, is we are seeing only a snapshot of the overall diversity in the history of this earth. And we know the pre-flood world was incredibly diverse. We see that as in a reflection in the fossil record in terms of, the creatures that we see. So what we see is not transitional. It's a reflection of pre and post-flood diversity, especially in the immediate post-flood world. You had these rapidly changing environments, which through natural selection or epigenetics, okay, which is that extra layer of complexity on top of the genetic information system, that can change and adapt based on the environment, and millions of genetic switches just waiting to be turned on and off. Okay, so the evolutionists, they can pick up these bones that are essentially just a reflection of pre and post flood history, and build whatever story they want. Okay, so that's the point that I'm trying to make is the law of monophyly is better understood from the creationist perspective. We understand what it is. We're not denying it. The only thing is they are guilty of what's called the extrapolation fallacy. Okay, dogs produce dogs, but apparently dogs today came from something more basal, and that more basal ancestor, if you go back far enough in time, apparently came from a single-celled like organism. Okay, no, that's an extrapolation fallacy. We don't see that. Natural selection and mutations being the source for genetic variation, according to the evolutionists, are deleterious, damaging, disease-causing. You're not going to take a bacteria-like organism to a biologist over trillions of years. Time is not the hero of the plot for evolution. Okay, so that's the point I wanted to make. Yes, we find a few interesting mosaics, but we don't find thousands and thousands and thousands of interesting mosaics to the point where we can say, okay, banana plants and whales are related because we've got all this evidence. No, all this evidence is not there. So I know that was long-winded, but I wanted to make sure we were addressing that.
Well, we find thousands of broken bones, which are interpreted as whatever they want to interpret them based on their imagination. But, going back on your ancestry, I mean, I've asked this question of many evolutionists about Luca, obviously Luca was the first in that tree, the root of the tree. How did Luca become an archaea, prokaryote, and eukaryote? Surely that's outgrowing your ancestry.
Exactly.
So it's a ridiculous argument, I find it, because I think many have said, like the dog only produces a dog, but go backwards. The dog must have come from a non-dog. Right. So it has outgrown its ancestry from their point of view. I just find that unbelievable. But
a single-celled like ancestor is a non-dog. Okay, dogs produce dogs, but you go back far enough in time, and apparently a dog today came from something non-dog, something they would call like a basal canid, and that basal canid, go back far enough in time, came from what? A single-celled like ancestor.
Now Donnie,
that's a non-dog.
Donnie, that evolutionists usually appeal to convergent evolution when they're talking about echolocation, for example. I was going to bring this up with Charles Darwin, but here are some extreme examples that actually show the real fallacy of that argument. Let's look at some now, right? You've got humans and turtles can hold their breath underwater. Is that convergent evolution? Turtles can't think, but humans can. Is that divergent evolution? If tricycles can race cars alike are found to contain both aluminium and iron, did they obtain those through blind, unguided processes? It is with two different mammals, bats and whales, that use sound for echolocation. Neither the similarities nor the differences prove convergent evolution or divergent evolution, for that matter, unless you start with that assumption. You see that key word, assumption. It's a non sequitur to conclude they evolved. That's the thing.
Let me say this, actually. I'm sorry, Professor McQueen and George, so we got a critic in the chat. Anytime that the evolutionist invokes convergent evolution, they are admitting to a lack of uniqueness in this universal phylogenetic tree. And the last thing I'll say, too, to leave no stone unturned, what these evolutionists will do, because they'll say, well, Charles Darwin predicted transitional forms and we ended up finding, XYZ. They'll point out a number, Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, for example. Okay, these predictions are not precise predictions. It's the type of predictions that, for example, we see today bicycles and four-wheelers, okay? So we would predict, well, somewhere out there must be a tricycle. And lo and behold, we find a tricycle and we put it right in between a bicycle and a four-wheeler. There's evolution. And that's essentially what they are predicting. Of course, we're going to find some interesting mosaics, but the fact is we don't find countless to the point where we have no choice really but to tap out and concede to universal ancestry. Anyways, we got Charles Darwin back here. Good to see you, Mr. Darwin.
I've been listening to you all, and the audience may have noticed me yawn. A lot of what you all talk about epigenetic DNA and all that's boring to me, because you're missing the point of a lot of things. I know you've talked about birds, and I've seen eagles fly all in my life on the voyage of the Beagle and so forth. And so you talk about some of my colleagues that are evolutionists in the 20th century found this bird called Archaeopteryx, which does look like a legitimate transition to me between dinosaurs and birds like this. But you all are also troubling me by missing the point of other things I wrote. If you would turn in your copies of The Origin of Species to the last 3 pages, notice what I wrote here. Authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. And so once I have a few minutes of say on my own, I want Mr. George and Mr. Donnie to talk for a moment about the immutability of species. I mean, surely after all these 160 years plus, you must see evidence that one species has become another, that you can have from artificial selection of 2 dogs produced with time a Chihuahua and a St. Bernard. Why are you two so critical of the analogy between artificial selection and natural selection? But let me read on, since I wrote this and it's viewed by a lot of people as an important book. So let me read it. When I view all beings not as special creations, but as lineal descendants of some few beings that lived long before the first bed of the Silurian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled. Judging from the past, we can safely say that there's not one living species that will transmit its unaltered likeness to a distant relative. So you're missing the point, I believe, of the analogy between artificial selection and natural selection. But furthermore, you're forgetting my background. Although I was wandering around a bit at certain points in my academic career, I did take time to go down to what I called an entangled bank. And so in the last paragraph of my book, I go back in my mind's eye to Scotland and to England, where I saw and contemplated an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth. You see, Mr. George, I have thought about butterflies and caterpillar. They're nothing more than a worm. And to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and yet dependent on each other in such complex manner, have all been produced by the laws acting about us. You, as an engineer, Mr. George, apparently argue that an elaborately constructed form, such as a well-built bridge or a bird or an insect, must argue that if you find a watch, there must be a watchmaker. I understand from looking through McQueen's books that some of the people that love me have actually written a book called The Blind Watchmaker. You don't need a watchmaker. But let's read on. What are these laws that I discovered in my scientific research from the 1830s on? These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction. Are you going to deny that creatures grow up and reproduce? Inheritance, which is implied by reproduction. Variability from the indirect and direct causes of external conditions of life. Are you trying to tell me that Lamarck was completely wrong? And from use and disuse. Have you not read the book about the ratio of human population? The ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. I'm aware that some people have been critical of me for saying that my ideas led to some of the horrors that I've read about in McQueen's book in the 20th century. The 20th century seems to me to be a century of Holocaust and genocide. I never intended that to be the case. It is the case that certain people, like people in England, are clearly more involved than Scots that I was around up in Edinburgh and so forth. And so it seems to me a logical flow that you would have the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, the higher animals, directly follows. He claims that there's grandeur in this view of life. My own wife, Emma, spent from our marriage all the way up through the 1850s arguing that we're going to be thrown out of church over this. Well, some of my buddies wanted me to become Sir Charles, and they appealed to Queen Victoria to get me knighted. But because of her silly view that the King James Version of 1611 was true, she refused to do it. Oh, well. But notice the last sentence that I say. And while this planet has gone cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Now let me go back to Mr. George and ask him a direct question. Are you saying that there's no evidence of modern evolution? No evolution occurred during the 20th century?
It all depends on your definition of evolution. If you're talking about changes or variations within a specific kind, yes, we know that as by the term epigenetics, there is observed adaptation, and that's why I wanted to bring the finches of the Galapagos. Apparently,
I studied those. Tell me what your opinion of those finches are.
well, before I get on to that, I would respectfully ask that you refer to me as Mr. Bond, not Mr. George, since I call you Mr. Darwin. I think it's
Okay.
respectful for you to call me Mr. Bond. Okay. And
I will do that.
I'm sure you're not aware that the Galapagos finches have been renamed as Darwin's finches.
Oh, how nice that they recognize my name.
Yes. Apparently, a lot of study has been done on these finches. And if Mr. Donny is in the chat there, if you could share my screen, Donny, are you there?
Apparently, you can step away from this black box.
Oh, yes.
I've been here, George, the whole time. I was just back studio.
All right, no worries.
Do your actually, before you do, we got a donation in from Jungle Jargon. I appreciate it. JJ, I appreciate the support. You guys are awesome. He says, oh, and lots of compliments, Mr. Darwin. People are really enjoying this interview, much needed interview. Jungle Jargon says, Mr. Darwin, do you know what the Table of Nations is?
Oh, back when I believed the Bible, I have read Genesis 1 through 12, and I'm aware of this mythology that was certainly affected in my day, where instead of looking at, these are illustrations that were in my first edition, instead of looking at my finches and realizing that was clear-cut scientific evidence, a lot of the Christians that I argued with would say, oh, the Table of Nations, give us an adequate explanation for the number of humans that are alive today, adequate explanation for language. But don't you know that language has evolved like everything else? It's foolish to look back at the Tower of Babel or to look back at the Table of Nations, as you call it, from Genesis 5 and 10. You see, I remember some things from over there.
Mr. Darwin, on that issue, I believe I heard you say that the lesser forms will be exterminated. Does that mean the black man and the Australian Aboriginal are considered lesser forms and they would ultimately be exterminated at some point?
Well, Mr. Bond, you clearly haven't read my biography well enough to know that when I was at Edinburgh, wasting my time trying to become a lawyer or a doctor like my daddy wanted, I got interested in taxonomy. And so a Negroid person that I had met was a taxonomist there in Scotland. And he and I cooperated together he taught me taxonomy, and he was very kind to me in that way. Now, in a public forum like this, I certainly don't want to comment as to whether I think that a good Brit like me would be more intelligent than Australians like you and Aboriginals and other races that I met in my voyage of the Beagle. I'm not going to speak that right now. So I would like to go to another topic.
Fair enough. Can I go back to my original argument of the Darwin's finches? If our host is there, I can share my screen again.
Yeah, I want to see what you make of my finches. Clearly different on the different islands of the Galapagos.
How's that? Can you see that?
Yes.
Now, just a bit of history for you, Mr. Darwin. It wasn't until the rise of neo-Darwinism in the 1930s that the Galapagos finches were elevated to their current prominence, by the way.
Yes.
Although they were first called Darwin's finches by Percy Lowe in 1936, it was the ornithologist David Lack who popularized the name decades later. But the interesting part you should note,
Yes.
and by the way, I will grant you this, that I think very little has been written about the finches in your book, but you'll notice that over a period of about 20 odd years,
Yes.
they've done these studies on the beaks of these finches, because a lot of people claim that Darwin's finches were proof of evolution.
Yes.
And based on this study, the chromosomic study, it shows no difference amongst the Galapagos finches and the DNA studies that have been used to construct molecular phylogenies relied on genes unrelated to beak shape. And you'll see there that y-axis is 9 millimeters to 10 millimeters. So
Yes.
the actual increase in size of the beak goes up and down depending on whether it's a dry year or a wet year, and we're only talking about 0.4 of a millimeter variance. That, I'm sorry to say, is not of any great significance.
Well, there's something else that's troubling about this. That's Holt Biology 2004. I've got Holt's Biology from 2012. And so in 8 years, notice that for some reason, they drop that diagram and they go on to sing my praise for Darwin figuring out, as they call it here, differences in beak shape by the spreading of birds to ecological niches. And so I would suggest that the writers of Holt and the biological community have shut the book on this counter argument of yours.
Well, that's what we call adaptation. Adaptation is not evolution. That's why I said it depends what your definition of evolution is. Adaptation is not evolution. An eagle with a hooked beak is still an eagle. That's still a bird.
Oh, it's still a bird, but is this not what I've heard Mr. Donnie say in the past? Is some sort of rescue device that you creationists are using to try to make my finches fly away?
Yeah, you know, it's funny to me, Darwin, that you would say, and you have said, that it's an amazing fact that all plants and animals are related. So you're saying that beautiful bird right there is related to a banana plant. Isn't that what you're saying, Mr. Darwin?
Well, in my discussions in the 1850s, no one put it quite like that. Now, of course, I had critics. Mr. Bond, if he were alive then, would probably have been my critic, and you too. But I was amazed that the editions of my book, you know, the first edition of 1,250 copies sold out the first day. So why were so many people looking for someone to explain nature without God? What's your view of that, Mr. Bond?
I apologize. I was concentrating on something else. Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. If 1,250 copies of my book sold out on the first day to a lot of people that had to spend an entire week's wage, the 15 shillings, how come my book was so popular in the 1860s? As did people view it as an alternative to Paley, an alternative to explaining how we are from the Bible? Why was my book so popular, and why is it still mentioned today in these very thick and expensive biology books?
People's imagination. There were millions of people that raced to the cinemas to watch a particular movie called Star Wars. So yeah, imagination has a remarkable effects.
Now, what is a movie? I don't even know what a movie is. But go ahead.
What is
It's
this Star
pictures that
Wars you
move, I
speak of,
guess.
George? Actually, if I could answer that, yeah, it sounds like so many people were unfortunately desperate to find a way to explain life, to explain the origin of species, and to explain the biodiversity of the planet without a god, without a designer, without a creator. So I think that's why they jumped all over your book, regardless of how unscientific a lot of its content was. As George pointed out, a lot of it is a science fiction based religion.
Yeah.
See, starting with my own dad, who was my critic, I've become tolerant of people like you two that are critics of my work. But do keep in mind that part of my reason for my apostasy is the death of my daughter. And as I think back on that time, in those days, I thought that God had blessed Emma and me with 10 children. And how sad it was when my daughter died. And it brought me to ask the question, and I'll ask you two this question. You are purporting to be Christians. How could a good and loving God, the God of Jesus as he walked in love, how could a good God allow my daughter to die? Why is there pain and suffering? It seems like my explanation of nature being red in tooth and claw is a much better explanation of what we actually see. How would you two Christians respond to that?
Why would you blame God for the death of your daughter? The Bible clearly, and you should know this because you have a degree in theology.
Yes.
The Bible clearly says that you shouldn't marry close relatives, yet you did. So
Yes.
why would you blame God for the death of your daughter when it's really your own fault in that regard? It may have been through genetic differences or similarities that caused your daughter to pass away.
Well,
And may she rest in peace, by the way.
yes, and I appreciate your sensitivity on that, but do keep in mind that in the 20th century, researchers at the University of Michigan found that if you look at Mongoloidism, there's only a 1 or 2% greater probability of Mongoloidism among first cousin marriages. So you're being too hard on me about Emma, but going beyond that to what I knew in the 1850s and 60s, I am simply arguing that what I saw in my voyage of the Beagle, what I saw in the Finches, and in my studies when I returned and put the book together, is that the Bible can't be trusted. If the Bible were a trustworthy document, then two things would be true. First of all, a loving and good God would not have taken my daughter away from me. Secondly, if the Bible is true, most of my friends, which include my dad and a number of my colleagues that were part of the Royal Society, as fellows as I was, they are condemned to hell. How can you justify this problem of pain with a loving God? You still haven't explained that to me, either one of you.
Well, God warned Adam and Eve about the consequences. And what we see as a result of that fall is what we call today as genetic entropy. And Mr. Donny knows a lot about genetic entropy. And it's clearly observable based on biblical ages of main characters. If you do a statistical analysis, you'll see that statistical analysis has an R squared value I'm sorry you probably don't understand this, Mr. Darwin, but when you get an
I
R
didn't
square
do well
value
in
of
math.
0.95, that is a very accurate equation. And my view on that is how did goat herders know about statistical analysis for a start? And how did they collude over thousands of years to get that nice fit?
That's a good point. Now, I'm tired of listening to you. What does Mr. Donnie say about this whole problem of human suffering?
I think that's a good, deep theological question, Mr. Darwin. And I think I would agree with Mr. James Bond over here, that it is a result, death, extinction, disease. It's a result of the fall, the world we live in, the sin of Adam and Eve, and mutations and disease resulting, being a ripple effect of this. But it's God who sees the bigger picture, and it's God who has presented us a way out with salvation. Mr. Darwin, you being a theologian,
well,
should
now
know that eternity.
Keep in mind two things. I'm getting tired of your all's questions, so I'd like to go to a question from the audience. But do keep in mind that the very strict orthodoxy that I had when I got on board the Beagle, by the time I got back and got married to this, what you all would consider theologically liberal woman, Emma, as a Unitarian, Universalist kind of attitude. For heaven's sakes, when she took, I didn't go to church in these days, but when she took our 10 children to the Church of England, whenever they would begin saying the Apostles' Creed, my wife would have the children turn and look at the back of the church. So I've been dealing with critics for many years. Can I actually read the Redefine Living question here and try to answer it?
Yeah, actually,
yes,
if I could touch on it a bit, because it's a great point that Sam brings up to help answer this question of evil and death and suffering. He says, remember, folks, bad is just an opinion without God's standard. When you reject God, you have no grounding to say anything can be bad. So if I could elaborate on that a little bit, the evolutionists, they have a naturalism kind of religion, right? So they want to reject God. But if there is no God, and evolution, survival of the fittest, universal common ancestry best explains our existence, then death is the hero of the story, right? Animals and creatures and species, they die over time. They go extinct, and hopefully, out of the dying of species comes, a species that's more adapted, stronger. So there really is no standard for the evolutionists, those that reject God. But for us, we can make sense. Being a theist, having God as a foundation, we can make sense of the world.
I have a trouble with what Redefine Living is saying, and you and Mr. Bond is saying. Are you saying that even though I had cast off the Bible, I would not view the death of my daughter as being bad? It's not just an opinion; it's an honestly bad thing that happened to me. What is wrong with that critique of what Redefined Living says? I mean, as an atheist, I could still recognize that a child dying is a bad thing for the family, and a child living is a good thing. Where's your critique of that?
But why do you consider death as a final act? I mean, if you're a true Christian, you're with God. After you die, you're with God.
It's a good point. Now, you two in the audience certainly need to understand that by the time 1859 had come, and I'd written the book, and then it went through the 1860s with Emma. By that time, I no longer believed that the Bible was an inspired document. I no longer believed that it was the standard for living. And so in a way, Mr. Bond, your point is well taken. I had come to the view that nature is red in tooth and claw. And so struggle and death was what moved evolution along. It was a way of naturally selecting things. But if I look back on my thinking, the year of my daughter's death, it was clearly a bad thing. A good God should not have allowed that. But even in my context of being a person believing that the death of innumerable creatures had brought me into existence, even in that context, I could recognize the death of my daughter as a bad thing. And if she had lived, a good thing.
And I think Sam nails it here. He says you can recognize it even when you reject God, right? Atheists can recognize what may be good, what may be bad, because the Bible says that God has written his moral law on everybody's heart. So we naturally can recognize what's good and bad, but it's the theist, it's the Christian that has a foundation for recognizing that. While the atheist has to borrow the Christian worldview just to state their opinion that, you know, this may be bad, this may be good, but we actually have God as a foundation. Go ahead, Mr. Darwin.
Well, when Emma would bring Christians across my path after the death of the child, they would say a similar thing, that you understand that this is a bad thing, not because you are a Christian, but because you've got God's law written in your heart. Well, please understand that by that point in my life, the anchor that I once viewed the Bible to be, the compass that I once viewed the Bible to be, had gone from my life. And so, although a great many people argued with me, a lot of the people that I would travel and have tea with, people that would write me letters, would be very complimentary of the idea that we could look around at physical characteristics of humans, and by measuring the size of their brains and other physical characteristics, we could tell who were more evolved than others. And we could put our emphasis in that way. Are you saying that there are no anatomical differences between all the different nation groups on Earth? Is that what you're saying, Mr. Bond?
No, there aren't. We're all humans, as the Bible describes, mankind. We all have red blood running through our veins. We all have a heart and a brain and two eyes, a nose. The only difference is the color of our skin, really. And apart from that, we're really all humans.
And remember, the Bible says, and hath made of one blood all nations of men.
Well, again, you're assuming that I can base my argument on the Bible. What if we go to data like a lot of the Neanderthal skeletons that I think had been found in my day showed this very prominent brow ridge, which I could see or did see among the animals that I saw. If I show you this model of the gorilla here, you can certainly see in profile his brow ridge. And then, as people have depicted the evolution of man from ape, you can certainly see in the ancestors a prominent brow ridge. Why will you all not accept this as data, which argues against a creator?
Because there's more differences between a human and an ape than just the brow ridge. There's many other differences. And those depictions between the ape and the human are really just interpretations of someone's imagination. There is no clear evidence to suggest that progression ever occurred, except in a person's own mind and own imagination.
And if I could, Mr. Darwin, since your time, we were
Yes.
talking earlier about DNA and genetics. We've actually discovered that every single human being on the planet, regardless of any kind of morphological difference, we are all 99.999% similar. And even the Neanderthal is 99.7% similar, regardless of all the differences. We're that close genetically.
Well, now keep in mind that when I think of the word genetics in my context of 1850, I'm thinking in terms of Gregor Mendel and in terms of what you guys, I guess, call the Punnett square. So you have an explanation for red flowers and white flowers and so forth. Keep in mind that when I looked in the microscope in my day at the cell, I saw three things. I saw a cell wall. I saw something kind of fuzzy in the middle that apparently you guys call a nucleus. And then there was some liquid between the nucleus and the cell wall. Now, apparently, some people have been critical of me, like this Behe guy, who says that the black box for Charles Darwin was not a black box like sits in front of me now, but the black box is that I misunderstood the complexity of the cell. Do you have any of your diagrams there, Mr. Bond, that could show me the complexity of the cell and what I was missing?
I certainly do, Mr. Darwin. I'm just going to bring it up for Mr. Donny to share with me.
Okay.
Let me bring it. I would love to show Mr. Darwin right before you do that, George.
Okay.
That the depiction of the Neanderthals you're talking about from some brutish ape man now, 2015 to 2021, almost 2022, there's been a drastic revision in our understanding. Mr.
Now, are
Darwin.
you saying that this child is supposed to be Neanderthal?
Yes, it's
Yes.
a Neanderthal child, reconstruction of a Neanderthal child from Gibraltar.
Well, that's certainly data that I did not have in 1850, but I know enough to know that even in my day, people drew pictures of me talking to apes and stuff like that. So I know anything can be done in an artist conception. I worry that you two have been tricked by apparently something you think is very important inside the nucleus. I can't imagine what it would be.
Let's have Mr. Bond.
Well, I'll share that diagram that Mr. Darwin asked for, just to show him what modern science has been able to do.
This evidence that you're presenting is causing me to sweat on this end here. Yeah. I'm so glad when I go back in the time machine, I'll be able to forget whatever this is that you're trying to show me here.
Can you see that illustration there?
Oh yes, very complicated.
Okay, now going back to your time, Mr. Darwin, the cell, as it was depicted in your day, is known to be far more complex today. It actually resembles a factory of parts, all synchronized, by the way, towards pre-programmed goals or algorithms. If you had known this fact, would you ever propose your theory of natural selection? Because what we have found today, we call lots of times, if we can't understand something, we call it a black box. But every time we dig deeper into it, we find more black boxes. And this was the case. This was the case with the cell. We're still finding things we never knew about. It is far from a simple cell.
Well, this fellow, Professor McQueen, before he left me a list here of things called Golgi bodies and endoplasmic reticulum and all kinds of things that I don't even know what they are. But you got to understand that since I have rejected the Bible, no individual bit of data that you could present to me would argue against my theory, because I became so convinced that my theory is true that I argued it among Christians and others during the years after the death of my daughter. And a lot of this argument comes back apparently to the fact that you two men and many of, I see that someone in the occult has asked me the question, would evolution disprove the Christian God? And the answer is clearly yes. That if evolution is true and nature is red in tooth and claw, these two Christian men have no adequate explanation to assuage my sorrow over the death of my child.
Well, I'll go back to ask what his particular definition of evolution is, because there's a number of different definitions you can use. So if you're talking about variations within species, then no, because they're programmed to do that. Epigenetics has shown that to be the case. However, there's no science that can show that one kind of or a non-dog became a dog.
Well,
I can use that terminology.
I can answer at least what this fool Professor McQueen thinks occult, Nino, is. What's the definition of evolution? Well, before McQueen left, he gave me a copy of a book written by a guy named Moody on evolution. He claimed that he actually used this book as a text at the University of Michigan in the mid-'70s. And if you flip through the book, at the end, there's quite a chapter about theistic evolution. But Moody's definition of evolution is that all organisms that we see today are the modified descendants of previously existing organisms. And it seems to me that that's a perfectly reasonable definition of my natural selection idea. How would you two critique the idea that all creatures that we see alive today are the modified descendants of previously existing organisms?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Darwin. Your proposal was that there was a warm pond, or I like to call it rock soup, that was struck by lightning, and that's how we got the first living cell. That would, in my eyes, that would disprove God. That today is called abiogenesis, and there's no scientific basis for abiogenesis. There's lots of theories and hypotheses and whatever, but nothing has ever been demonstrated that you can get
now,
rock
Mr.
soup
Bond,
to become biologist.
Mr. Bond, you need to understand that one of the truly troubling things to me from this 2-hour discussion we've had is I really expected the transitional organisms that appear on McQueen's evolution-based chart here to have shown up. I am disappointed more than ever that these transitional forms have not been found. The absence leads me to a very troubling conclusion that the foundation of what I was thinking is wrong. So you two are saying that some of the evidence that I predicted has not turned out to be true?
Very, very much so. Pretty much every part of your book has been disproven, as I said earlier. That's why they've now scrapped the theory of evolution, and they've adopted neosynthesis, the third way. There's so many that that's impossible to. They just change it almost on a yearly basis, really.
But explain to me, Mr. Bond, why in a thick book like this used in high school biology, my praise is still sung. They hail me as one of the greatest scientists ever. Why would they do that, Mr. Bond?
Well, if you'll find in 5 years' time that biology book that claims things are true or facts will change. So everything about evolution is claimed to be a fact, but they just keep changing the facts. That's the thing. So if it's a fact, it shouldn't be changing.
I have talked to Mr. Donnie that at the end of their discussion, and we're coming down to the last 5 minutes of the second hour, that when I take my hat off and I take my 18th century tie off here, which I can't do because Ms. McQueen is used.
Hey, Donnie, I think we've been fooled. That's Professor McQueen. That's not Mr. Darwin.
That's right.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
I thought I was really having a discussion with Charles Darwin here.
The time machine did not bring me forward. And so what I want to do now that I'm back to the good old Professor McQueen is I'd like to take 5 minutes to express my sadness over what Darwin came to. In his life, the things that he wrote in his autobiographical writings are truly shocking and sad. This thing that I read about Darwin's view of hell being a damnable doctrine is very troubling to me as a Christian, because a loving God brought the great flood on the earth, which I've seen evidence of. George and Donnie and I have talked about this in previous episodes. The great flood is a event of judgment, which shows that the sin of Adam and Eve, he took very seriously and destroyed a world of perhaps 100 million people by the events of the Great Flood. So Darwin's rejection of God being both the creator and the savior and the coming king ignores the fourth part. God is the creator, but he's an offended creator. And he requires the blood of sacrifice, the blood of bulls and goats, culminating in the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus, celebrated by our Christmas time, which is less than a month away. Let me read you a paragraph which follows. I'll go ahead and reread this because it's so troubling to me as a Christian. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, which would include my father and my brother and almost all of my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. Let me insert some C.S. Lewis here. C.S. Lewis wrote that life is like a game of chess. A game of chess cannot be fairly played unless it's possible to lose it. You can't have free will unless you, at a certain point, can make a decision that I do understand, and yet I'm going to be a successful rebel to the end. So let's read on about what this rebellious Charles Darwin said. Although I did not think much about the existence of a personal God until a considerably later period in my life. What? What are you saying, Charles? That In the 1860s, you began to change your mind. Let's read on. I will here give the vague conclusions to which I have been driven. The old argument of design in nature that Brother George, Donnie, and I both believe is an enormous evidence for a creator God. Darwin says the old argument of design in nature given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue that, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by man. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the winds blows. Everything in nature is a result of fixed laws. Can you see in the audience tonight that natural selection became Charles Scott? That for many in our modern world, they are using the concept of natural selection, which they falsely link with the idea of artificial selection. 2 dogs, and then you can get all the different large and small dogs. They falsely argue that natural selection is adequate to explain the real world that we live in. What they fail to recognize is something that George and I are going to talk about in January and on through 2022, and that's the number of evidences for the truth of the Bible. George and I are going to begin in January with a presentation about the historical sightings of Noah's Ark that provide objective historical evidence that a very large boat is at least above 14,000 feet, even though it may be broken into pieces. But don't miss the forest for the trees here. Darwin is wrong because, for the same reason that many of your friends and your relatives, people you've spoken to in high school and in college are wrong, they reject the Bible as God's word. React to that, my friends, and I will end my 2 hours with you.
I'm sure that Darwin thought he was right, and he thought that in the ensuing years that we would find all the things that he predicted of transitional fossils and so on, and that hasn't been the case after 162 years. But I'm sorry to have to tell Mr. Darwin that after 162 years of study into his theory, I summarize it pretty much like this: evolution is nothing more than presuppositions supported by vivid imagination, unproven and unverifiable assumptions, biased and subjective interpretations, outlandish speculation and conjecture, grounded in untestable hypotheses, which makes evolution no more than just so stories. Reading The Origin of Species, it was true in the time of Darwin, and it is still true today.
Right. Now, because of the way science fiction works, we could not reveal the day that Darwin died because he can't go back in the time machine knowing when he's going to die. But now that I'm back to Professor McQueen, I'll build on that excellent summary of George with this idea. Charles Darwin died the year before my grandfather was born. So let's do the math here. My grandfather was born the year after Darwin died. My dad was born in 1914, and I was born in 1952. So, George, what does this mean? We're only 4 generations away from a living Charles Darwin that viewed these things as absolute fact. And so part of our reason, George and I, for cooperating with Standing for Truth is so that men the age of Donnie can raise their children to not lose a grip on Jesus and the Bible, because it's only 4 generations ago that this evil idea of evolution came to be. Can you see my point there, George?
Oh, definitely. I was just going to add, I do it because Donnie pays me big bucks.
Yes, that's true. Remember that the 15 shillings that he sends each month does add up to $100.
Oh, David, just to lighten up a little bit.
Yes.
How does a man show that he's planning for the future?
He puts a lot of money under his bed.
Close. No, he buys 2 cases of beer.
2 cases. Yes, this is
What about
humor here.
what about this one, David? What is the difference between men and government bonds?
Men, there's no difference. They both fail eventually.
No, the bonds mature.
Oh, yes. Ms. McQueen, as you've seen, is walking around. We don't want her to ponder that too greatly.
Well, that was a great show, Professor McQueen, Charles Darwin, and George. Tons of laughs, tons of fun, very lighthearted at times, but also very important, because this is an important topic. So
Right.
Fantastic job to the both of you.
I have enjoyed letting the 2 of you finish things off. So if you will allow me to move my cursor down here past Origin of Species and leave the studio, I will see you guys and wish you Merry Christmas. We'll resume again.
And God bless you, David and Shirley.
God bless you. God
Thank you
bless
so much. We're looking
Mr.
forward
and Mrs. McQueen.
to Christmas time, and we will be back in January. I'm leaving the studio.
God bless.
God bless.
And great work. Any final words from you, George? And then I'm going to spend just a couple minutes going over some reminders for the audience.
I'm just going to ask you to share my screen as my final words, because
Absolutely.
I always get
Take your
really
time, brother.
touchy when I read this. So just bear with me, and I'll let the people in the chat actually read it for themselves. Please don't get into this. You're treating Darwin and evolution as your god, when really that's an abomination. But this is my final comment, so I'll let you read it. Just leave it there for about 10 seconds, Donnie, and then I'll stop sharing it. Merry Christmas and God bless everyone.
Merry Christmas, brother, and God bless. God bless. Beautiful way to end it, George, as always. Merry Christmas to you as well, Iron Matt. We do have Professor McQueen and another important show first thing in January. So please share this around. I got to say, I think it was a great way to learn a lot about Darwin, his life, as well as just kind of what has occurred and changed since Charles Darwin. And I learned a lot too. So George, great job, great work, brother. And also to Professor McQueen. So
thank you, Donnie, and God bless you and Merry Christmas.
God bless you, George, and Merry Christmas. So
yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I'm going to spend a couple minutes, George, just kind of going over some reminders and stuff for the audience. So, I know you got things to do as well. I know you have your your dog who might want to go for a walk, and if you, it's up to you. You can either stay or feel free to go enjoy your day as well, brother.
I'll stay. Now, listen, don't tell anyone, but I'm going out for a pizza on Friday.
Your
Don't
secret
tell
is safe
anyone.
with me,
Yeah.
except we're still alive. So now everybody knows. George, because of you, now I'm craving some pizza as well. So, especially those pictures you send me.
I haven't had one for about 2-3 months, I think. Yeah, something like that.
That's some good willpower, George. That's some good
Yeah.
willpower. You've earned yourself a well-deserved pizza, and with all the work you've been doing for the ministry, all the work you're doing for the Lord, I really hope that award for being a top co-host you're one of the best co-hosts in the history of co-hosts. So I really hope that comes in the mail one of these days.
Oh, thanks.
So I just wanted to remind everybody, we are striving to make 2022 even bigger and content filled than 2021, which is going to be a hard thing to do. We had a ton of content. You can go all the way back to January 2021. And that first week, you'll remember, George, time flies by. That first week, we had Jonathan Sarfati. We had Dr. Rob Stadler. We had Kent Hovind. We had a couple big debates as well. And that's almost a year ago. You probably remember that week, and it's been the same thing pretty well every week for the last year. Interviews.
And Donnie, don't forget to mention that we may be having a surprise Christmas special.
That's right, guys. So if we do, look surprised. So yes, you're right, which means there's still a lot to look forward to at the end of 2021 here. So anybody who's new to the channel, go to the website, go to the playlist section, check out, I think we're very close to hitting 100 interviews now. Most of those being done over the last year with top intelligent design proponents, top theologians, top young earth creation scientists. I mean, there's endless content for you guys. So what we've been doing is working hard to make 2022 memorable as well. So I am currently filling up the first several months of 2022. Check the events section, the upcoming live stream section, as well as the website. The web designer should be done updating the website actually in the next couple days. There's going to be a lot of changes there, so check it out. But tomorrow we'll be back here for a debate between CJ Cox and Stanley Terry, Jesus, fully God, fully man. And as you can see here, we got a ton of events, a good solid mixture of science, theology, soteriology, intelligent design, so on and so forth. Next week's going to be huge. We've got a big debate between Matt Slick and Joshua Gibbs for all you theology nerds out there. And I'm really looking forward to it as well. So I'm a theology nerd. And Kent Hovind will be back, take it on Jackson Rowe, the big round 2, much anticipated debate. That's next week as well. Kent Hovind and Jackson Rowe. And as you can see here, a lot of events set already for January and February with Trinity debates, soteriology debates, big one here between Josh Gibbs and Tyler Vela. Total inability debate, and a solid eschatology debate as well. But as George said, we might be having a Christmas surprise kind of special. And we're going to be working on hopefully a few more conferences next year. You guys know last month we had our Defending Genesis conference. That was a ton of fun. George, you deserved a vacation after that. 3 busy days, tons of information. Michael J. Ord, John Mackay, Dr. Diane Eager, Joseph Hubbard. So please check that out. That'll all be up on the website soon as well. I also just, I'm in talks with Dr. Dan Biddle from Genesis Apologetics. We're going to have him back on as well in a couple months. And of course, the movie Genesis that we have partnered with Creation Research, the Creation Research team on early 2022, I believe. that should be ready for everybody. That's going to be awesome experience creation from the beginning. So I guess that's pretty well it for me, guys. Just keep yourselves updated. If you're new to the channel, check the website, check the playlist section. George, go ahead, brother.
Donnie, before we forget, we do have friends in some of those big organizations like ICR, CMI, AIG, Creation Research, Ken Colson, Genesis Apologetics. So I know they watch not particularly every show, but if they are watching, God bless you all.
Amen. Amen, brother. God bless the Young Earth Creation Ministries that stand up for the truth, that fight for the truth, and that work pretty well just 24/7, giving us evidence for the faith and a defense against those who want to attack the Bible and attack essentially the history as has been laid out in the Bible. I typically point out that the Genesis is a history book of the universe, and we know that the scientific data strongly supports that being the case. Ryan Daniel, that says Creation Ministries International in my own backyard. That's awesome. That's awesome, man. So well said, George. Merry Christmas to all the ministries out there that are fighting for the truth and standing for the truth. It's important. So I appreciate that, George. You're the man with the plan. Any final words before we actually shut it down here?
No, I've enjoyed it today, actually. So yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Of course, George. Always, but remember, this is a team effort. This is a team effort. So
one last one, Donnie. How many men does it take to change a roll of toilet paper?
I don't know.
Nobody knows. It hasn't happened yet.
Funny and true.
Yeah,
my wife can attest to that.
Yeah.
Hey, that'll be my New Year's resolution. I'm going to start changing that toilet paper roll for. George, that's good, brother. Laughter is the best medicine. So God bless you. I've had a ton of fun tonight. I've had enough laughter to the point where I had some tears coming down. So God bless you, George. God bless Professor McQueen. God bless everybody in the chat. Thank you for tuning in, standing for truth, and George Bond are out.